noting that we have an apology from Councillor Tim Lawrence. And I think we are expecting 2 other councillors to join, circumstances permitting. Councillors, does anyone have a conflict of interest to disclose this evening? No, we'll note that there are no conflicts to disclose, and that brings us to confirmation of the minutes of the previous planning meeting. Do I have an indication by someone who'd like to move those minutes? That's moved by Councillor Amir and seconded by Councillor Williams. Thank you. All those in favour? That motion is carried unanimously. That brings us to consideration of reports, and the first report on the agenda tonight is the application for a planning permit for 35 Dean Street, Preston. I'll hand over to Mr. Darren Rudd and Mr. Joylan Boyle to talk to us about that. Once we've heard from the officers, I will invite the objector and the applicant to speak to us also. So, Mr. Rudd or Mr. Boyle, I'm not sure who's leading off on this one.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, this first item is at number 35 in Dean Street in Preston. It's located on the west side of the street. It's a site of 746 square metres in area. A general residential zone number 2 applies to the site. There are no overlays, and the planning scheme cites this as a site for incremental housing change. In terms of the application response before us, it's 3 two-storey dwellings. All the dwellings contain 3 bedrooms and have access to a double garage for 2 car spaces, and all are accessed along a shared driveway along the southern boundary of the site. In terms of the style of the dwellings, they have sort of a gable form to their roofs, and they're finished in brick, render, and a vertical seam cladding to the external walls. In response to this proposal, Council received 11 objections. And those objections covered things like overshadowing, neighbourhood character, and impact on vegetation. So I might just bring up this actual proposal on the screen. So what you'll see is the site there in the context of the adjacent properties and showing the development as it relates to those adjacent properties.
So can I just stop you there, Mr. Boyle? I don't have that up on my screen. So the screen sharing hasn't happened yet. Try again, perhaps.
Okay, there might be a delay.
There we are. Thank you.
Okay, so what we have there in front of us is the ground floor plan. So what you can see is a driveway running along that southern edge and leading into the various garages. And then at ground level, the dwellings provide their living rooms all at ground level. So they're all very similar layouts. And then these 2 dwellings, numbers 1 and 2, have their rear yards facing north, and then the rearmost dwelling has its rear yard facing west. Moving to the upper levels, they all contain 3 bedrooms. There's a 2.5 metre separation between the upper level areas of each of the dwellings. And what's good is that they've actually applied setbacks from the upper level to the side boundaries and the rear boundary that exceed the Res Code requirements. So that helps to reduce the apparent visual bulk associated with those upper levels. In terms of a recommendation, this is recommended for approval, and the conditions touch on issues addressing landscaping, ESD, stormwater, tree protection measures, and the height of boundary walls. So that's the end of that recommendation. So are there any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. What we'll do is we'll actually hear from the applicant and the objectors, I think, first before we get to questions. So thank you for telling us, giving us that information about the application.
Right.
I'll ask perhaps that both the applicant and the objector turn on your video and your mics. So we're expecting Mr. Craig Walters, and we're also expecting the applicant, Mr. Nick Petroulis.
Should I stop sharing?
Yes, I think, Mr. Boyle, that would be great. You could stop sharing now. I see that we've certainly got Mr. Walters with us. I'm hoping that Mr. Petroulis isn't having any difficulty joining. He
Yeah.
is. Thank you. So what we do in these situations is we always hear from the applicant first, followed by the objector. And then after we've heard from you both, I'll get you to go back onto mute, and councillors will then have an opportunity to ask further questions of the officers. I'm just double checking. Thank you. So as per our governance local law, you have 2 minutes to address the planning committee. So Mr. Petroulis, over to you.
Hi guys, thank you for the opportunity. I'll go as quick as I can. I have I've got a few concerns in the direction the application has taken. I was the person responsible for putting up the town planning application notice board, and I was a person responsible for removing it. Upon removing it, Mr. Walters has approached me, and basically, to cut a long story short, he boasted how he's managed to delay many applications around the area, and he's also said that. So,
Mr. Petroulis, can I suggest that your presentation will be most effective if you focus on the merits of the application?
Okay,
I would really encourage you to focus on the merits of the application.
Okay, I'll do that right now. He's also said that he's got a very good friend who happens to be a councillor. I thought nothing of it, but the direction that the project took, with one objection at the time, it was just the one. We went to a councillors meeting, which is fine. That's all well and good. Then if you guys have a look at the other 10 objections, they're actually a photocopy of Mr. Walters' objections. So are they really an objection or a petition? I've got no problem with objections, but this is a petition. Then I made an inquiry with town planning, and they advised that we're going to a councillors meeting, which once again I haven't got a problem with. Solar panels. If you have a look at Google Earth, not many people put solar panels on lower roofs. His whole house is full of solar panels. The solar panels have strategically been placed on his lower roof. They've been placed there after the application was made public. They've strategically been placed in order to obstruct and get in the way of this application.
So, Mr. Petroulis, that's your 2 minutes. Thank you.
I thought I was going to have 5 minutes. That's what my email says. I haven't got long to go. If you give me a moment.
Okay, I would suggest I will, Mr. Petroulis, on the basis that there's been some misunderstanding, and we did have a change to our governance local law a few months back, which I think has changed the timelines. On that basis, I will give you 1 further minute. I would urge you, as I said before, to focus on the merits of your application.
Okay.
Because
application
2 minutes and we haven't heard about your application yet.
Okay. The application comes with shadow diagrams. The shadow diagrams don't make it past the actual fence where the solar panels are placed. One of your councillors made an 11th hour request on Friday. On Friday at 5:41 p.m, advising that they would like shadow drawings of a winter solstice. all applications are based on the September equinox, which is the standard for that all applications are measured on. So that's all I've got to say. Darebin City Council have an amazing town planning department. We've just got to let them do their job and not obstruct. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Petroulis. Mr. Walters, Mr. Petroulis, in fact, was granted 3 minutes after some confusion, so I will equally grant you 3 minutes to talk to the Planning Committee.
Oh, thank you. Our objection was very clear about the overshadowing impact on our solar photovoltaics and solar hot water. I have not seen an overshadowing plan until yesterday, which I'd like to point out, though it had the same date as all the other plans, was not part of the plans released by Darebin Planning. However, having looked at it, I now accept that the solar PVs will not be impacted at the equinox. I am still unsure as to what will happen with them in midwinter. They have made no attempt to look at that. But worst of all, planning has made no attempt to define the impact on our solar hot water, which in midwinter will substantially wipe it out. And I'm trying to share the screen with you to show you the diagram. Can you see it?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Walters.
That's what will happen at 12 p.m. The garden also gets obliterated, as I've discovered. And at 3 p.m, it goes like this. I think it's a travesty that we made it very clear in our objection about the impact on the solar hot water, and nothing was done about it. Nothing was looked at it. They only mentioned solar panels, not solar tubes. Now, this application is business as usual to moonscape blocks, denigrating any plantings by calling them exotic, poor health, or fruit trees. 4 trees are in a position where they could be retained. Tree 6 is especially good because it would give us screening, but also the bottlebrush and Piaggio are also in established plants in beds that will be part of the design. One thing that the Darebin Planning does not recognise, and we mentioned it specifically, is that all of the houses around here have one feature in common, and that's that they have eaves on the house. But nowhere does Darebin Planning ever consider that this stylistic feature forms part of our neighbourhood character. In fact, we get all these boxes without eaves. It's more business as usual to demolish well-maintained houses.
Thank you, Mr. Walters. That's 3 minutes. Thank you for your presentation, and both to Mr. Petroulis and Mr. Walters, thank you for taking the time and working out the technology so you could join and make those presentations this evening. You may now turn off your videos and
Thank you for having us.
Great. Councillors, you can now ask any further questions of the officers. Councillor Messina.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. I've got some questions in relation to the solar tubes. In relation to this particular planning application, we mentioned solar panels. Does solar tubes also fall into that category? Through you, Mayor Rennie. I have a number of questions, by the way, Mayor Rennie.
Thank you. We'll start with that one.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, yeah, the solar panel or the solar impact of a development upon a panel or a hot water system is somewhat of a grey area in planning. I think there's a few things to consider, whether the location of those facilities is reasonable. So on or near the boundary would be not a good outcome and would, I guess, be unfair to object or to prevent a development where they're poorly located. I mean, I think in this case, the panels, the solar panels are on the lower story and the upper story of number 33, and they're facing north. I think that's fair enough. And I think the same with the hot water system. That's also a solar facility. So impact needs to be considered, but again, in the context of their location and the reasonable location of the said development as well. Having said that, I might just share the screen again. And what you see is the street view and the pattern of development consisting of various single and double story houses.
Mr. Boyle, we haven't got your screen again yet, so I'm not sure what's happened to the sharing.
So what you see in that streetscape elevation is a series of single and double story houses, including the double story form at the rear of number 33. And that's the pattern of development generally in most areas. Buildings are generally centrally located, a driveway down one side and a garden down the other. That's the formula we see in most developments. So in this case, the new development's taller than the current single story house on the property, but it's certainly further set back from that common boundary with number 33. And for the sun to overshadow those panels, it would almost have to be, close to your 4 o'clock period, almost horizontal with the roof of this proposal. So I think for the most part of the day, even during the winter, the sun is high enough in the sky. It's simply not going to reach that level of overshadowing, certainly not the panels on the upper level section of the adjacent property. And I think what we have in front of us is a reasonable response to neighbourhood character and to the expectations of what a development would be in terms of its height and location. So it's hard to kind of argue that development shouldn't go ahead purely on the grounds that it might overshadow a panel for a section of the day during the winter period.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. Councillor Messina, you have a further question?
Yeah, I have two. Has VCAT ever declined or objected to a planning permit based on eaves not being part of the neighbourhood character? And has that been a condition of any refusals in the past?
Gee, that issue alone, I hazard a guess, wouldn't have been a ground for a refusal at VCAT. I think you'd have to sort of tie that in with a series of other design issues for that to be a worthy ground. But I think on its own, that's a difficult one to substantiate in this case.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
My next question and my last one is, has there been a meeting between both parties in relation to the removal or a new location for the solar tubes? Has there been any mediation in relation to that?
None that I'm aware of. Perhaps that's a question for the applicant and the neighbour, but certainly that hasn't come across in the officer report. But there certainly has been a great deal of analysis of the shadow impact, but not of a potential relocation that I'm aware of.
And is there any other room for the solar tubes to be placed on any other part of the roof that will gain the maximum benefit for the residents at 35 Dean Street? 33 Dean Street, sorry, apologies.
Well, I think so, but that's again a question for the owners of number 33.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor Rennie.
Thank you, Councillor Messina. Are there further questions from other councillors? Councillor Williams. Just Councillor Williams, take yourself off mute. Thank you.
My question is, my concern, I think I have more than anything regarding possibly the mental health of 33 Dean Street, for reason being that the development on 35 is obviously double story. Can you tell me about the development at the rear? And obviously there's a major development. And then if somebody decides to develop on the other side of 33 Dean Street, virtually they'd feel quite boxed in, is my concern.
Yeah,
Does
true.
that
I
make
mean,
sense?
there
It's
is,
like 2-story here, 2-story there. It just needs one other side, and I'll feel that, you know, it's a bit confined.
there is a two-story, or there is a medium density development to the rear of 33 on Murphy Grove. So yes, you're right. If there was another development to the south of 33 at number 31, yeah, they'd have more development around them than say other dwellings in the street. But it's a question of fact and degree, and whether the new development, if there is one to number 31, whether that's a reasonable outcome in and of itself. So we'd have to look at, again, like for 35, whether the setbacks are reasonable and whether the outcome, when you're weighing up other factors in the planning system, like the need for more housing, is a reasonable outcome. But yeah, I acknowledge there's more potential development next to 33. But again, I said in my presentation, there's that's been dealt with in the sense of there being larger upper level setbacks than would otherwise be allowed under Res Code. So up around the 3 metre mark. So nearly double what Res Code could potentially allow. So there is that balance. But again, if number 31 had an application, we'd have to look at that on its own merits, regardless of what the other sites have got on their properties.
In saying that, so number 31, if they decide to develop, does that mean that restricts 31 to a bigger scale of scaling right back, like it's really as they're potentially in developing at all due to suffocating obviously 33? Am I making sense? Like,
yeah, I know what you mean.
Developing this side, does that mean we're stopping the opportunity of 31 being developed?
No, in considering number 31, that we wouldn't be able to consider the impact of 35. I mean, that is a different relationship to 35. 35's to the north, so there's obviously a different type of impact. 31, again, would be considered in isolation and considered in the context of number 33. We couldn't suddenly draw upon, the impact that number 35 has on number 33. That wouldn't be the case, no.
One more question. Where is the driveway to number 31? Is it the south or north side of the property?
Is to the north, so it's directly adjacent the common boundary
35.
of 33. It's likely, though, I suspect, if number 31 were redeveloped, that driveway, like number 35, would flip, simply because you then get advantage of the north aspect. So you might find number 33 will have a driveway to its north as a result of this development, and it might have a garden to its south if 31 were redeveloped.
Yeah, what I thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Are there further questions from other councillors? There are no further questions. Is there a motion?
No, I have a question. I have a question. Is there, with this particular planning application, is there scope, and will we have the acceptable time period if both the objector and the planner were to sit down and discuss the relocation of the solar tubes? Do we have enough time?
Mr. Boyle?
Do you mean in this forum, or do you mean
in a separate forum, not in the planning committee now? Is there enough time for them to go away to discuss the relocation of the solar tube so that it meets both the applicant and the objector, and then it can then come back to planning if it needs to be?
I must admit, I need to get a bit more information on that to know whether that's even a possibility and whether the owner's even considering it. but it sits outside the subject site, so it's a little tricky to do via a planning permit condition, that's for sure. It'd have to be something done purely on a voluntary level by the owner of number 33, probably in direct discussions with the applicant. I don't think we can facilitate such a change outside the boundaries of the subject site.
Okay.
That would,
Thank you.
yeah, that's beyond the scope of the Planning and Environment Act to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. Any final questions, councillors? Thank you, Mr. Boyle. I'll get you to stop sharing your screen now. Thank you. Councillors, is there a motion? Councillor Newton.
I'd like to move the officer's recommendation.
Thank you. And that's been put up on the screen. Councillor Newton, I'll just get you by nod of the head to indicate that that is what you expected to see and what you've moved. Thank you. Is there a seconder for that motion? Thank you, Councillor Amir. Councillor Newton.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. So I've definitely heard the applicant, the objector. I know that there are concerns over the solar panels and the overshadowing, but I've also listened to what our officer has said about the fact that it will only be at certain times in winter that'll be affected. So for me, I think this is a reasonable development. Like we've got one later that goes from 1 house to 8 potentially. So I think going from 1 to 3 is reasonable for the site. And if you look at the compliance, it has a high level of pretty much everything. So for me, this one is supportable while definitely listening to the objector's concerns. But I think it's something that can be worked out.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. Councillor Amir.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, this is one that I called up to Planning Committee because I thought it was worthy of close consideration, and myself and Mayor Rennie went and visited the site to have a look and to see what the impact would be. When I saw the plans, I guess I felt relieved to see some of the features with the building being further towards the site on the number 37 rather than number 33, with the bulk at the back where the solar panels are at the front. So as Councillor Newton said, it is a highly compliant proposal. And also we often see similar kinds of developments where there's more units on the site, where potentially it goes up to 3 stories rather than 2, which is consistent with the house next door. So were we to refuse this, I feel confident it would be waved through at VCAT, possibly with poorer outcomes and definitely with greater cost to the to ratepayers. So while I absolutely empathise with loss of sunlight, I know how important it is. It's very important to me as well that I think there will be a development similar to this on this site, and in other contexts it may have an even greater impact. That said, I do agree with some of the comments made earlier that from a community perspective to be some of the comments made by the applicant were not consistent with the kind of community spirit that I would hope to see in Darebin. That, to be honest, when I heard some of those comments made, it made me reconsider my view because it made me concerned that we weren't all working collaboratively together in a way that I hoped that we were. And usually what we hear from applicants, which is
Councillor Amir.
was that time? Yeah,
that's time. So Councillor, I should have said the clock is counting up rather than counting down. So if you are the mover of a motion, you have 3 minutes as usual. If you are the second or a subsequent speaker, you have 2 minutes. So thank you. Are there further speakers? Councillor Messina.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Rennie, I just want to thank the applicant and the objector. And I too visited the site whilst to have a look at the concerns of the objector. We have three townhouses, 3 bedrooms, and quite a substantial living area. The setbacks comply. I've asked the relevant questions regarding the eaves, and I look for precedents at VCAT. Should this be refused by the planning applicant, if it went to refused by the planning committee, and if it went to VCAT, would VCAT override it? And I can't see any reason for VCAT to say no, to refuse this particular objection, the planning permit. The only thing I suggest is that perhaps the objector and the owner of number 33 sit together and work out a relocation of the solar tube. So therefore, there could be some middle ground for both the objection and the planner on this particular case. I'm sorry, but I'm actually going to approve this on the basis of what Councillor Newton and Councillor Muir have said, because there's not much scope for it to be rejected at VCAT.
Thank you, Councillor Messina. Are there any further speakers? There are no further speakers. I'll therefore put that to the vote. All those in favour? And against? Thank you. That motion is moved. We had councillors Rennie, Messina, McCarthy, Newton, Amir and Greco voting in favour and councillor Williams voting against. Thank you, councillors.
Sorry, Mayor Rennie, it's
Yep.
Councillor Lasserf here. I don't know if you saw my hand, but you didn't call my name out.
Thank you, councillor Lasserf. No, I don't think I did. So thank you. Can you tell me, just remind me how you voted so I can call that out?
In favour.
Thank you, and we'll note councillor Lasserf in favour also. I would like once again to thank the objector and the applicant for coming to speak tonight to the application. The planning committee has decided to approve the permit. This decision can be appealed to VCAT. Objectors have 21 days in which to lodge an appeal with VCAT. The applicant has 60 days to appeal any condition of the permit. Notices detailing the decision tonight and how an appeal can be lodged will be sent to all objectors and the applicant next week. Thank you. We'll now move to the second item on the agenda tonight, which is the preparation of a development plan for Village Bell. Mr. Rudd, were you wanting to speak there?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Rennie. What I'll do is I'll put the image of the development plan with the heights just on the screen, if I may. Can everyone see that?
Not yet. It's coming, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. This item seeks council approval for the Village Bell development plan, which spans across two distinct precincts, both sides of St George's Road, being the former Huttenham estate, which is Stokes and Penola, and the Kenwood Court area towards Railway Place on Oakover Road. The future of this area is described in the planning scheme, and it's certainly been a site of community interest since the former public housing in the Huttenham estate was demolished in 2012. There's been a series of periods of community engagement spanning from 2013 to recent times, as this proposal has taken shape from an early concept in the planning scheme through to what's presented before council this evening for consideration. The development plan before you proposes a mixture of dwelling types and building heights ranging from 2 to 3 stories up to 10 stories. The development plan proposes a yield in the order of 450 to 650 dwellings, and this includes 131 social housing dwellings or up to. This is proposed over multiple stages, with the social housing to be delivered in the early stages of the development. The report before you explains how the social housing is to be achieved, and please note in the planning scheme there are discretionary heights up to 8 stories. The proposal before you proposes 9 and 10, so above those discretionary height limits, and that is done, and the community benefit that is promoted is to agree to provide the additional social housing. So as explained in the officer's report, the proposal includes those 2 stories above the preferred height limits. Included in the proposal is also a number of commercial sites, and there are some community facilities and communal facilities. The proposal also includes new cycle and pedestrian connections through the site, in addition to enhanced landscape treatments and new open space areas. It's important to point out that the development process sits separately to the planning approval process. It's a precursor, and in this instance, being used to coordinate a planned and orderly level of development ahead of and to guide what is to be quite a major redevelopment of the site. Under the planning scheme, council is required to first approve the development plan before it can consider individual planning permits. So at the moment, the plan before you proposes around 9 stages. As outlined in the report, there's been quite extensive notification. Some 660 letters have been sent out to owners and occupiers, in addition to 19 signs that have been placed across both the 2 sites. In response to the notification process, council has received a total of 24 submissions, including a petition with 16 signatories. The issues raised in submissions are outlined and responded to on pages 41 to 47 of the officer's report. Overall, as outlined in the summary, the application is considered and has been assessed as being able to offer the potential to achieve a high quality and quite transformational redevelopment of the proposed area that's described as Oakover Village in the planning scheme and is presented as the Village Bell Development Plan. Some of the points to highlight: the commitment to deliver additional social housing above what the planning system can achieve and above what was agreed through the Public Housing Renewal Program. There's also, as outlined in the report, a high standard of ESD is committed. There is going to be comprehensive and wholesale improvements to the landscaping. One of the other points to raise is there's been a willingness to listen to some concerns that have been raised about Newman Reserve. Some of the early concepts did promote significant overshadowing, particularly during the winter solstice. A lot of that has been pushed back, and you'll see on the plan that's up on the screen, there's an 8-storey and a progression back to 10, and that is to ensure that there's a reasonable level of sunlight in the winter solstice achieved to the Newman Reserve. So overall, the recommendation is to support the proposal. There are some conditions there that forecast a holistic assessment of possible and potential development contributions, to guidance of streetscape improvements. The development contributions are to consider improvements within the site, but also to forecast through an evidence-based assessment through a traffic management plan what contributions that the development benefit from or might trigger beyond the site to ensure that its impacts are appropriately mitigated and considered ahead of some of those planning applications. That's my brief presentation. Thanks, Mayor Rennie.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. We have a couple of objectors listed to speak this evening, and we do not have the applicant listed to speak. So the objectors that we have are Erin Schroeder and Andrew Walsh. I'll ask if Erin and Andrew could join the meeting by turning your cameras on. Here's Erin, and Mr. Rudd, I might get you to stop the screen sharing too. So we're hoping that Mr. Andrew Walsh will join as well. He's in the meeting. Here he comes. Fantastic. Thank you. So Erin and Andrew, I'll give you both 3 minutes equally to address the planning committee, and you'll see that there should be a clock on your screen that will count up to 3 minutes, just to give you an idea of where we are with the time. Erin, you're top of my list, so we'll start with you.
All right, thanks, Mayor. My objection regarding the Village Bell development plan is with the proposed 8, 9, and 10-story apartments. These proposed building heights are far higher than any buildings that currently exist in the area, in particular with the site referred to as Stokes Penola, where the current maximum is 4 stories. An 8, 9, or 10-story building clearly does not respond to the existing or preferred neighborhood character of the area. These apartments will be on the same street directly next to residential zoning areas, which have a clear cap of 4 stories. The developer suggests that the proposed development to the north of the apartments is providing townhouses as a measure of respecting and transitioning, but it's not about respect or creating a transition. It's simply about the fact that they can't construct higher than 4 stories in those areas. Also outlined in the introduction of the development plan, the intention for the development is to deliver inspiring, connected, and integrated precincts and capitalizes on existing conditions or future possibilities. The potential 8 to 10-story buildings is clearly capitalizing on future possibilities, and indeed the private sector, and ultimately it sets a precedent for future buildings of equal or greater heights. The response to this on the record that was submitted suggests that this can't be substantiated, but it does state it in their own plan that they're considering future possibilities, and therefore they must consider what these apartments will do to the future of the neighborhood. In fact, the land currently directly to the south of the proposed 8-story building on Newman Street is for sale, and no doubt the development would encourage buildings to match or exceed the proposed development apartment height. They are using the current neighborhood character to sell the Village Bell development, and this development will help to eventually erode that character in the end. I want to make it clear, this objection is absolutely without a doubt not about social housing. There are already 2 relatively new social housing buildings in that area, and they absolutely respond to the neighborhood character and certainly enhance it. The proposed buildings that match them are certainly welcome, but the proposed apartments, they're not. The Stokes Penola site does not have any buildings higher than 4 stories nearby. The proposed apartments are not on main arterial roads. They're not even on a thoroughfare. They're on side streets, and those are clearly residential. So I'm not suggesting that that the Village Bell development shouldn't go ahead. I simply think that further consideration is needed to lower the height of the proposed apartments so that they can fit within the neighborhood character of the area. And that's all.
Thank you, Ms. Schroeder. Mr. Walsh, over to you, equally 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the opportunity tonight to speak. My sister and myself have lived on Oak Cove Road for some 30 years, and we've been watching the plans for this development with great interest. We've attended most of the meetings, and we also see this as a great opportunity locally to transform the area with a diverse range of occupiers, both residential and commercial. I'd also, I was able to speak to Matthew Cullen and get my point across, but the thing we're mainly concerned about is the traffic, the increase in traffic in this area, particularly in speed and volume. There's a lot of traffic now coming off Gilbert Road, coming down Oakover Road, and also now coming off High Street, coming down Oakover Road, the other way to St George's Road. And what we're finding near us is that the side streets off Oakover Road to Miller Street, such as Davies Street particularly, Devon Street, Carthew and Mitchell, are particularly becoming like rat runs from people trying to get in off the, I suppose you could say, the traffic lights at St George's Road, Oakover and St George's Road. The traffic is getting very heavy. It's also very fast. And one of the things we'd like to propose some sort of signage or speed limit in these streets, because a lot of people don't seem to take any consideration about the residents living in the area. We feel that there's some traffic management tool needed in these streets, particularly Davies Street. People trying to go across from Oakover Road across and come out the other end of St George's Road. There's been a lot of development in housing around this particular square, and the square, I mean, is sort of from Miller Street down to Miller Street Shops up to Gilbert Road, come back down Oakover Road across to St George's Road. This square, there's been a lot of renovation on houses, a lot of young families, and the traffic getting heavier and heavier. So we feel very strongly about this, and that's why the letter of such to the planning. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. And thank you also, Ms. Schroeder. Your presentations tonight are very much appreciated. You can pop yourself back on mute and turn your camera off if you'd like, but please continue to watch the meeting and listen to the debate.
Thank you.
Councillors, you now have an opportunity to ask any questions. Councillor Messina and then Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you through you, Mayor Rennie, and thank you for the objectors speaking tonight. I also have interest in this particular development. My questions relate to 3 topics, and does a development plan include changing places toilets? I know that. Does it include a graffiti management plan, and does it include a waste management plan? Or is that only in the separate planning permit? Do you include those 3 requirements moving forward?
Thank you, Councillor Messina. Mr. Rudd?
Yeah. This process doesn't get to the specifics of particular facilities, but what the recommendation before you, it certainly does say there needs to be consideration through a streetscape master plan, but also improvement plans to Newman Reserve and details of other open space reserves within the precinct. And certainly as the detail is worked through with those proposals, so too would there be consideration towards facilities. There's also in the recommendation, I'll point out that it's put forward that the open space contributions that are likely to be required from the development are put forward to improvements, in particular to Newman Reserve. So those conversations could be open, and what we're saying in the recommendation is that they should be plan-led and they should be a result. What you would hope is a progressive conversation to make sure what's provided and delivered best serves the community.
Sorry, Mayor Rennie, I have 2 supplementary questions. The first one is that can that be a condition of, can those 3 topics be a condition of the development plan? And how has this particular development plan, the fluidity with the level crossing removal, given that there are some changes in the infrastructure of public transport there, will this development plan also include the level crossing removals in terms of the traffic management to and from elevated rail such as Bell Street?
Yeah, there's 2 parts there, and they are related. So one of the reasons there needs to be a plan-led approach, and it refers to a plan-led approach in terms of open space, is you've touched on the level crossing removal. There's additional linear open space there provided, and what goes on that space is still being resolved. And what we're saying here, that there ought to be a plan-led approach and a broader precinct-wide approach or neighbourhood-wide approach to determine what ultimately is best positioned to serve the community. Our recommendation is that it's probably too early to get to the specifics to say, look, it needs to be this or that in particular with this proposal. What we would probably prefer to recommend is that it's looked at the broader context in terms of traffic management. And I think there's general agreement with what was stated by the submitters in terms of traffic flow and movements. There's an intention there to further a study, and that will look at, because you're quite right, one of the things that will happen is the crossing is removed from Oakover Road, so too are delays. So arguably that's an enticement for through traffic on Oakover Road, and the concerns raised, which have also been raised in some of the traffic assessment work done at council's end as well, is that for at least a decade, the residents in this general area have been raising concerns about rat running and the like. So the intention of the recommendation and the traffic study and looking at calming and behavioural change and how that can be promoted through works is definitely part of the recommendation and would be a requirement of that traffic management plan and the agreement. And what the agreement works out is the stages at which some of those elements would be provided, with the hope and the expectation that something is done to make sure that at least as far as this development's concerned, it's mitigating some of that through connection, some of that rat running, and it's calming the behaviour of through traffic if it's coming through the area.
Thank you, Darren. Councillor McCarthy.
Thanks, Mayor. Councillor Messina picked up on one of the questions I was going to raise, so I won't go there. Just to understand, if I can, through you, Mayor, to our officers, in relation to the required contributions from the developer, could we just get a little bit more information about what is actually legally required and what is council's ability in terms of making the developer responsible for any impacts on the local community, both in terms of the park, Newman Reserve, and also the traffic management arrangements as well. So how can council shift that responsibility and that financial contribution back onto the developer?
I'll start with the park. Well, it's a legislated requirement, so it's already in the planning scheme to require a contribution to public open space. For this site, it is, despite the planning scheme amendment underway, it's 5% for this site. Separate to that, with development contributions, there are tests in the Planning Environment Act where council has to, if it doesn't have a development contribution plan in its planning scheme, the only mechanism it can really do and achieve development contributions is via an agreement. In this case, it's a section, what we refer to as a Section 173 agreement. That still has to pass the legal tests of determining a charge for a development contribution. There has to be analysis to establish anything that council's requiring a contribution for is needed, that there is a linkage level of the future this development achieves to what you're asking them to contribute towards. So, for example, one of the things we could say is that if there are signal changes required to Oakover Road traffic lights and St George's Road, council could not ask for a wholesale change from the development. All it can really ask for is a contribution that's proportional to its percentage increase in traffic volumes for a period of time. So there also is a thing that we have to call, there has to be a temporal nexus. So you can't say, look, we want you to pay for something and we're going to deliver it in 30 years' time. It has to be closer, it has to be a more immediacy level of benefit. So we have to be fair and reasonable. We have to have a level of a portion contribution that's linked to the need that particular development's creating. So yes, you can ask for traffic calming works in the neighbourhood. You can ask for cycle path connections that may span beyond the site. But as you go further from the site, you start to diminish the level at which you can ask the development to contribute.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. Councillor McCarthy, a further question?
Thank you. Yeah, just a further question in relation to Mr. Rudd's answer, and thank you for that. Just in relation to that temporal nexus point that you raised, I'm just wanting to understand as well whether either in the development plan or in a planning permit or in the traffic management plan, whether council can make it essential and required that traffic calming measures and the implementation of the traffic management plan occurs either predating or at the same time as the development, so that surrounding residents don't have to wait further year, 2 years, 3 years to feel the real impacts of this development. So whether the infrastructure change can occur consistent with the development delivery.
Yeah. So thank you, through you, Mayor Rennie. The intention of the condition is that exactly occurs, that ahead of the first planning permit being developed or the first development, that there's some understanding that council's able to communicate to the broader residents where there might be raised threshold treatments, which are actually proposed in this instance. So there's already been a conversation with the developer highlighting that there will be that need for traffic calming in the surrounding streets. And what that agreement will be working out is which particular stage that they are to be provided by or through.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you. And along the same lines, just to be clear, can council also require that any upgrades, which I expect would need to be significant to Newman Reserve to offset potential impacts of overshadowing and other impacts of increased amenity, can those upgrades be required, funded and delivered through the contributions of the developer in advance of the development or at the same time as the development, once again, so that surrounding residents can actually benefit from any change as quickly as possible?
Yeah, so the intention of the condition there is to do similar to that, is to, again, before the first stages are developed, that there's at least an improvement plan developed for that reserve so that it's understood. And my expectation is there'll be a conversation with the developers about how their contribution might be able to use to benefit the immediate area. And that again be a plan-led approach where it relates similar to the questions that Councillor Messina raised earlier about there's a conversation about the type of facility, the standard of facility that the developer might contribute to in lieu of a cash payment, which can also be required under the Subdivision Act or a planning scheme.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. Councillors, are there further questions?
Yes.
I've got Councillor Newton, Councillor Greco, but Councillor Greco, go ahead.
After allow Councillor Newton, she put up her hand before me.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. I just through you, Merini, I just had a question about, I know that they're talking about more yield, but I know that with the Oakover Road development, there were 26 houses there, and we're now talking about a 6-storey building with 35 dwellings. So I was wondering what that means in terms of how many bedrooms there were in the houses that have been knocked down now compared to how many bedrooms there might be in that 6-storey dwelling. So the question is really just about when they're talking about yield, is that accurate when you're talking about knocking down houses and building a 6-storey building?
Mr. Rudd.
Yeah, one of the things our report talks about is that there's a housing needs analysis. And one of the things it's saying, I think, is there's 44 it refers to that are adaptable. And that concept and notion's generally supported. So you are quite right. Those previous dwellings were family-sized accommodation. And the proposal's talking about these 1 and 2 bedroom or 44 adaptable dwellings. Now what they're able to do, and there's some diagrams included within the development plan documentation which was circulated, that discusses and explains how these can be combined, where a 1 and 2 bedroom can be combined to become a 3 bedroom. And I know this was an issue that councils raised regarding other housing projects and the loss of family accommodation. They were early questions raised in the pre-development phase of this proposal. The officer's assessment is there's some attraction to having an adaptable style configuration. And yes, there is a level of good faith that that's what will indeed occur, that if a family is needed to be housed, that they can, and that we don't start, or we're not in a situation where people are excluded because they're limited by hard boundaries of 1 and 2 bedroom dwellings. We're sure that's not the case, because one of the things we're mindful of is that the need for housing and the bedroom sizes, the composition of dwellings, the composition between family and single homes, for instance, does change over time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. Councillor Greco.
Thank you, Meredith. I have a number of questions, and so through you to the officers. I'll firstly start off with from the urban design perspective, looking at where the social housing is planned to be situated, whether there are sufficient enough safeguards to ensure that the social housing will not be segregated from the remaining development. And I say that on the back of the notion of the salt and pepper approach to integrating social housing with private housing.
Mr. Rudd, thank you. Councillor Greco.
Yeah. Through you, Mayor Rennie, there's mixed research on this. Certainly some of the earlier research was saying that and advocating, as Councillor Greco has explained, the salt and pepper approach, which means across a site which is up to 650 dwellings, they're scattered and they're indistinguishable. In this instance, there are there are three distinct buildings proposed. Some of them have a plan, some of them are entirely DHHS properties. But what they are is, and the development plan assessment and report says, is that they won't be highly distinguishable from other forms of development that will be developed within this proposed development plan. However, just in response to Councillor Greco, the answer is yes, some of them will be in separate buildings and will appear in exclusive buildings, if you want to describe it as that.
Yeah. But my next question is just in relation to, we have a report here about the housing diversity report that's accompanied this application. And that report talks about a 50% target for social housing. And I was just wondering what the weight of that report has been in the formulation, if it has had any weight in regards to establishing the overall mix of the site.
Yeah, thank you for this.
In relation to our assessment and what weight we gave the housing diversity report.
Yeah, thank you. Through you, Mayor Rennie. This is one of the inherent challenges in the planning system and probably relates to a strong advocacy position that this council has had and has proudly had for a number of years. And that is that through the planning system, it's quite inadequate in terms of what council can insist and require through its planning processes in terms of development-led social housing. So Councillor Greco is referring to the housing needs analysis. So need is one thing, and it's well recognised throughout Australia and particularly in metropolitan areas, and Melbourne has an acute social housing and public housing shortage. So there's need on one hand, and then there's what the system can deliver. And that says a 50% allocation. The allocation that the private developer was contracted to do with DHHS for this site was 30. The agreement that they've been voluntarily put forward as part of this proposal, which does come with it the additional height, is to take that up to 131. That's well in excess, if you were just solely relying on the planning system, well in excess of what the planning system can enable and deliver. So all council has in the planning scheme is we can insist and require to some extent on affordable housing being achieved and delivered through a site. We aren't able to insist and require social housing. And it's one of those challenges, and it links back to what council has been advocating for a long time in terms of need and what you can actually require through a planning scheme. They're certainly different things. Thank you.
Thanks. Just two more other short questions, if I may, through you, Mayor. Also in relation to the concept plan that's accompanied this development plan, just if you can explain and provide greater clarification that if we vote in favour of this development plan, are we essentially voted in favour of the concept plan? And I suppose I'm asking that in terms of then what would trigger the concept plan coming into effect as a result of us endorsing this development plan?
Yeah, through you, Mayor Rennie, and this is probably an important question too for the residents to hear. It is, if you approve this development plan, you are essentially approving a conceptual plan. So what you are providing and you're providing endorsement of is heights at these particular locations that the planning applications can be subsequently lodged at a later stage and go up to and achieve those levels. One of the important things this particular plan does, which is separate to those controls in the planning scheme, it's proposing a lower height near where existing residents are. For example, the planning scheme says 4 stories. This proposal is suggesting 2 to 3. But the assertion's quite correct. You're approving a concept plan and this particular concept. So if conceptual elements are changed in the future, this plan has to return back to council, back to the planning committee for another decision.
Thank you.
And if I just may, just 1 or 2 other questions, which I think are important, just leading off from that, because the conceptual plan, I understand, was based on, if you like, the community benefit in terms of, providing extra levels, therefore. But I note that the community benefit, I want to understand what the rationale was, because I know that the community benefit is actually 2-1 in favour of private housing versus public housing. Like we're getting 220 extra private dwellings as against only 96 public dwellings. So I just want to understand in my mind how that constitutes a community benefit.
Yeah. So one of the things the planning scheme, because of discretionary heights, it describes generally there has to be a demonstration of community benefit. And it refers to an example of community benefit is an increased quantum of social housing. So the challenge that the officers have had in this negotiation is that to get to this particular point is that the starting base and what the planning scheme can allow or support is 0. And it's certainly recommended that it is better than any particular agreement that we've been able to achieve, certainly to present to council as an officer recommendation. It's not really with precedent. It's above and beyond what's been able to be achieved. It's because the starting base and the supports in the planning system overall are so low, we don't think it's an unreasonable proposition that there is the 2-for-1 ratio that Councillor Greco's raised as a point.
Okay, and my final question, and I'll just stop here. Again, the proposal talks about that 20% of the private dwellings will be exclusively available to first home buyers for a period of 6 weeks. Can we extend that? And the question is, not only can we extend it, but can we insist that that is extended indefinitely?
Through you, Mayor Rennie, that question's come up this afternoon. So we've actually been given the opportunity to just canvass that particular question, at least in terms of an extended period. So we've had an agreement from the developer to say, look, willing to consider 12 weeks rather than 6 weeks. As far as making it in perpetuity, we've not raised the question, but there may be some challenges because usually the rate and the percentage of sales are important. And I think we're getting into a grey or a murky area without asking the question, making that in perpetuity. But certainly we've raised the question about 12 weeks and that's generally supported.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. To those councillors who haven't yet had an opportunity to ask a question, are there any final questions? No. Great. Does anyone have a motion? Councillors, I'm waiting for someone, please, if there's a motion.
I'll move the motion if.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Is there a seconder for that? Councillor Newton, thank you.
Sorry, no, I've got an alternate motion.
Well,
I'm happy to withdraw.
Okay, Councillor Amir has withdrawn. Councillor Newton, you have a motion?
Can I give Councillor Greco an opportunity to move?
Well, I've asked all councillors if there's a motion. I hope that someone has a motion they wish to move tonight.
Okay, in that case, can I move the motion that was circulated just before 6 o'clock? So it's been circulated to all councillors and it's an alternate motion.
Thank you. I'll get that put up on the screen, and Councillor Newton, because that wasn't very precise, I'll get you to just read the motion that's now on the screen and confirm that that is the motion that you intend to move.
Yes. Can I just say this? Yep, that's fine. Yep.
There may be further pages, so
yeah, can I see those pages?
We'll just go through a bit and make sure. Okay, Councillor Newton, thank you for moving that motion. Is there a seconder for the motion moved by Councillor Newton? Is there a seconder, councillors?
Mayor, I can't second this as I've got amendments, but I'd be happy to second it if I could incorporate my amendments into this.
So I can't do that at the moment, Councillor McCarthy, so I will seek a seconder for this motion so that we can debate it. Is there a seconder? It's a final chance or it will lapse. Is there a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Amir. So we'll hear from the mover and the seconder. I would encourage your councillors to really be sure of what's in this motion, because it may incorporate some things that others wish to raise as amendments. So Councillor Newton, we'll hear from you as the mover. You have 3 minutes, and then we'll hear from Councillor Amir, and then Councillor McCarthy. I note that you flagged some amendments. So Councillor Newton.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. So I was listening quite closely to what Darren said about how this is more than the very, very basic of what we can get with social housing on a site like this. But when I was reading the report, it really bothers me that what we're talking about is what was public housing land that's now going to be some social housing and more private housing on this land. What we've got in this report is something that wants to play off social housing against height. As we heard from the objectors, we're talking about 8 stories, 9 stories, 10 stories that is not in the area currently. This is about public housing land becoming social housing and mostly private housing. And as I asked in my question, what you're talking about is knocking down houses that have been knocked down, and you're talking about, even though it's adaptable, mainly 1 and 2 bedroom apartments that are going to make up, in some cases, 1/6 of the site, but nowhere more than 1/3. So for me, the reason that I'm putting forward an alternate motion is I think that we should get more yield of social and public housing on this site. I think we should be wanting 50% minimum. I think we need to be calling for that. It's very consistent with Darebin Council's position on wanting more social housing in our area. And this is such a good opportunity to really have an incredible mix. There's a lot to like about the report. There's a lot to like about what's been looked at and what's been thought about. But I just think that as a council, it's incredibly important that we fight for as much public housing and social housing as we can. I know there are some risks to doing this, but I think it's incredibly important for us as a council to take a stand. And that's all.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. Councillor Amir.
Thank you. I am seconding this for the purposes of debate, but still undecided as to how I'll vote. I absolutely agree with Councillor Newton that it's pretty disappointing to see such big chunks of public land going into mostly private housing. And while, you know, it's been pretty clear that the plan is that housing should pay for itself, I would say, what is the purpose of government if not to provide for the basic needs of people in our community. And other than, you know, you've got oxygen, you've got food and water, and then after that, you've got housing. So if that's not a basic need, I don't know what is. So I'm really disappointed to see such a large number of private dwellings on this site. Once it is in that private hands, there's no way we're going to be able to ever get that back again. And it's so difficult to be able to find sites of that size with that flexibility. That said, I do acknowledge the hard, excellent work that's been done by the planning team to negotiate up from where we were before, with an even smaller, even more embarrassingly terrible low number of public housing units up to a larger number. So that's excellent to see. Also, I commend the good environmental sustainable design, the landscaping, and the changes made to reduce the overshadowing on Newman Reserve. There have been residents contacting me concerned about the impacts, and that's something that's been discussed at length tonight. But I do feel like while there's many good things in this development, it could be better. And so we have a pretty challenging decision to make ahead of us tonight, where we're being given the choice of not great or even worse. You're on mute, Susan.
Sorry. Thank you, Councillor Amir. Are there further speakers? Councillor Greco.
Thank you, Mayor Reddy. Look, the reason why I didn't second it, because I had a further amendment which would have blocked me from actually putting this further amendment to the motion that I had requested from the office. And I thank Councillor Newton for moving it and Councillor Amir moving it. That the further amendment that I want to put into this motion is an amendment in relation to the 6-week waiting period, and to extend that to at least 12 months. That's the waiting period for the private dwellings to be exclusively available to first home buyers. At the moment, it's 6 weeks, and I'd like to extend that to 12 weeks.
Sorry, Councillor Greco, I've heard you say two different things. I've heard you say 12 weeks and 12 months.
Sorry, 12 months, sorry, 1 year, sorry, 12 months.
I'm happy to accept, happy to accept that.
So that's been accepted by the mover. Is it accepted by the seconder? No, okay. Councillor Greco, I think it would be good to seek a seconder for that amendment. So is there a seconder for Councillor Greco's amendment? Councillor Messina. So we'll now debate the amendment, which is that the 6 weeks were, where those properties would be exclusively reserved for first home buyers be extended to 12 months. Councillor Greco, you have 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you for that. Look, the reason why I'm including this is that we know that there are gross limitations in regards to extending social housing on this site. And we know that, for example, that the site, 80% of the site is going to go to private developers. It's basically a land grab, as far as I can see, of private developers over this site. And so the social housing outcome that we're going to achieve is not going to be significant, even though the developer may argue that it's generous, and I also even dispute that, because whilst there are 26 social housing dwellings on the site, originally there were 70 on that site, but we're not using the base number of 70 because they were demolished back in 2011. So we can see that it's grossly underrepresented, this proposal, from a social housing perspective. So in order to tweak the various aspects of the proposal as far as possible, and in also to make it available to first home buyers, who you would expect will be people entering into the market, obviously for the first time, and not have much capital, and ensuring that we leave the private dwellings available for them to be purchased for a period of 12 months, not 6 weeks, as been suggested by the developer. At least I think we should be pushing for that and ensuring that takes place. It's not a substitute for social housing by far, but at least it is a way of impacting or affecting the private dwellings and ensuring that the private dwellings at least go to people who are first home buyers and assumingly more needy than investors in that case. So I would urge the councillors to support that. I think that it's something that we could do, and I think it would actually be something that the developer would most likely entertain. 12 months is not a long period of time, especially when they're selling apartments off the plan, and so a 12-month period would enable first home buyers to get access to some of those dwellings. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Messina.
I'd like to reserve my right, Mayor Rennie.
Thank you. Councillor McCarthy.
Thanks, Mayor. I'm going to speak against this amendment. Councillors would be aware I've already foreshadowed via email this afternoon a proposal to increase the period from 6 weeks to 12 weeks. That period is effectively almost 3 months, and it is about as far as you can stretch it in terms of getting any developer, including the Victorian government, to agree to a scheme of this nature. The reality is, and it's a shame that we're not talking about 12 weeks, we're talking about 12 months in this amendment, is that the reality is that that would be struck out faster than you could imagine, because from a development point of view, there is no way that both the Director of Housing and also their private partner would agree to that, because it simply does not accord with the way in which this development is proposed. Now, we may not like that, we may not agree with that, but we need to deal with what the reality is that we're trying to achieve here. I won't speak in relation to Councillor Newton's proposal to basically provide the social housing that we need in this community. We'll get to that later on, but we need to be really clear about where we can push the developer to get the best outcomes. And that's why I have already foreshadowed an amendment to move to a 12-week period, not a 6-week period, which is really stretching it as it is. 12 months, for instance, cannot be achieved. And so that's why I'm not prepared to support this amendment, but I do foreshadow the 12-week option to ensure that first home buyers have that exclusive window before the open market is able to access those units.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Are there any further speakers? Councillor Messina, you reserved your right. Do you wish to speak?
I basically wanted to hear the debate for and against Councillor Greco's alternate motion. I'll wait for the vote. I'll wait for the vote to the end.
Okay, thank you. So we're now voting on Councillor Greco's amendment, which was to change the 6 weeks to 12 months. All those in favour and against? That amendment is lost. We had Councillors Williams and Greco voting in favour, and Councillors Amir, McCarthy, Rennie, Messina and Lasserf voting against. Thank you. We'll resume debate on the motion in front of us. Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to move, I've got 3 amendments that have been circulated. They're amendments to points 2, 3 and 10 that have been circulated to councillors. Officers should have them as well.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. You're proposing to move that as one amendment, the 3 points?
I think I've got a limit on how many amendments I can move. Is that correct, Mayor?
Yes.
So I'll move.
So if you move them collectively, that would be helpful.
I'll move them collectively.
Thank you. So they were circulated earlier. Is there a seconder for those amendments? Just give everyone a second to increase your screen size and get them. You can see the red on points 2, 3 and 10.
Mayor, if I could ask if the officers could actually expand the width of the page as well, please.
So we'll just try and get that up. Thank you, Councillor McCarthy, to make sure everyone can see it. That's it, even a bit more if possible.
Page width will do it, if that helps.
That's it. So I hope you can also, councillors, by using your cursor and moving the page over, you can increase the size of the screen as it's showing on your screen, I hope. So I'm not sure if we can get the page width up. I'm hoping people can now read that.
Maybe, could I just seek a clarification? So the amendment that has been proposed by Councillor McCarthy, does that replace the point 2 of the substantive motion?
So just wait, I'll just get some clarity on that if you hold on 1 second.
Sure.
So I point out that it's an amendment to the alternate motion that Councillor Newton put up. I'll just make sure we've got that right on the screen. I think it is important, councillors, we just take a little bit of time and make sure that we're absolutely clear. So if I could just check from the officers, Mr. Rudd, perhaps, if you can confirm whether Councillor McCarthy's amendment has been applied to the alternate motion that Councillor Newton has moved, not to the officer's recommendation.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. Yes, it's my understanding.
Okay,
Sorry,
and Councillor McCarthy, I'll just get you to look and confirm that what you're seeing as the red on screen is indeed how the motion would read with your amendments.
I believe points 2 and 3 are correct. Sorry, Mayor, I just would point out that point 1, A and B are not what Councillor Newton moved. They do not refer to the, as far as I can see, the 50% specification. I can't see 50% in the text.
Yeah,
there.
that's the original.
I think what you have on screen is the original. So my points 2 and 3 and point 10 need to be included with Councillor Newton's
yeah, maybe that was the basis of my question. Yeah.
Okay, so can I ask that the officers put up only the text in red, and that the text in red are Councillor McCarthy's amendments, and they will apply to the motion that Councillor Newton has moved, not to the motion that was in the agenda. So we'll try and only get to the red text up on the screen. And that might take a minute, but I think it is very important, given what's at stake here and the significance of this development plan, to take the time to make sure we are absolutely clear on what it is we're voting for. So I'll just remind you that at this point in time, we have a mover for the original motion, which was Councillor Newton, a seconder, Councillor Amir. Councillor McCarthy has moved an amendment. And that's what we're now going to debate. We don't yet have a seconder for this amendment. So once we are very clear what the amendment is, I will then seek a seconder.
We need a seconder if the mover and seconder of the substantive motion approve it.
Actually, that is quite correct, Councillor Amir. So the first thing I will do once we're clear on the nature of the amendment and everyone has clarity on that is I will ask the mover and seconder if they accept the amendment. So just for the record, councillors will have seen the motion that Councillor Newton has moved was circulated at about 4:05. So what you can now see, and someone's got a lot of noise in their background. If that's you, I might ask if you could put yourself on mute. What you can now see is that those amendments, Councillor McCarthy, have been applied to the motion that Councillor Newton has proposed.
Thank you, Mayor. If we could just scroll down to point 10, sorry, just so I can check.
Councillor Greco, thank you for seeking that important clarification.
So I wanted to ask a question, if I may, just a clarification.
It's not formally an amendment until it's been seconded, but Councillor Greco, on the grounds that it may actually be approved by the mover and seconder, I'll seek your point of clarification now, if you could ask that briefly.
Yeah, look, thanks, Melanie. It actually goes, and I apologise for this because we're online and it's, but I just wanted to ask for clarification from our officers that the substantive motion that's been moved in relation to point A and point B, if they could just explain what the significance of that is and what the implications of those two points are in A and B, those two red in the red writing. Because I think it's important that councillors understand what that says.
So Councillor Greco, I'm not going to allow that question now because that's actually not a question in relation to the amendment, which is what Councillor McCarthy has proposed. So
yeah, look, I understand that, Mayor. I said right at the outset, because of all the confusion with the online thing, that I think it's important that we get that clarification for the sake of us understanding then what we're going to be voting for or voting against at the end of this debate.
Okay, Councillor Greco, what I propose is that I actually deal with Councillor McCarthy's amendment first, and then I'd like to come back to that question that you've raised, noting that the motion that's been put up is different from the one that was in the officer's report, but it is a motion that had been emailed to you at your request also. So I think what we'll do is we'll deal with Councillor McCarthy's amendment because that's what we've got in front of us at first, and then we'll come back to you, Councillor Greco. So Councillor Newton, Councillor Amir, do you accept the amendment proposed by Councillor McCarthy?
Happy to accept.
Thank you. And Councillor Amir, I can see you nodding, but if I could just get you to confirm verbally, that would be great.
But maybe not loud enough.
Thank you. So Councillor McCarthy, your amendment has been accepted, so that is now part of the motion in front of us. Councillor Greco, I'll now return to you. You raised a question to the officers if they could explain the impact of the points that have been added to number 1, and that's A and B. So I'll go to Mr. Rudd and I'll ask also that part of the motion be put on screen. There we have it.
Mary, also, given that the amendment now has gone through, if we could get also some clarification on what the impact of the other amendment bits are, so that we get a full understanding of the motion before us. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Mr. Rudd.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. So at the moment, so what that's seeking to do is, at the moment, the development plan is proposing up to 650 dwellings. We've said in the officer's report there's up to 131 proposed social housing units or dwellings. This would seek it, so if it's 650, this would, condition 1A would require 325. The second element is the enabling mechanism to do that. So the way of giving effect to that is through a Section 173 agreement. So condition A is dealing with the quantum, and it's referring to specific buildings where that might be achieved. And then the second one is dealing with the enabling or the delivery mechanism to give effect to that particular requirement. And yep.
I was going to ask you to keep going in relation to the other amendments that have now been accepted.
Okay, if I could just get those put up on the screen, I can talk to them. Thank you. So I think conditions 2 and 3 are pretty straightforward. They probably clarify the intention of the conditions anyway. Just to crystallise that it includes cycling and pedestrian safety installations beyond the site. That certainly would have been an expectation of any future agreement, and to clarify and I suppose provide endorsement condition 3 towards exploring genuine improvement plans for Newman Reserve. And 10 is extending the, as we discussed earlier, the period for the opening for first home buyers for the 20% to go from 6 weeks to 12 weeks.
Great, thank you, Mr. Rudd.
Thank you.
Councillor Greco, I hope that provides the clarity you're seeking. Councillor Messina?
I would like to foreshadow an amendment to Councillor McCarthy's alternate motion.
So,
Or amended
Councillor
motion.
Messina, just be clear, this is not Councillor McCarthy's motion. Councillor Newton moved this motion.
Apologies.
Councillor seconded it. So you can propose an amendment to this motion, or you can foreshadow an alternate motion should this motion not be successful.
Okay.
If you have an amendment, I'd suggest you actually suggest the amendment now.
Yes, item. I don't have the original amended alternate motion on the screen, but I'm assuming it'll be point 11. And that is, I've just circulated it, and that point 11 will be that future planning permits issued in the development plan, including a minimum of 1 changing places toilet in each of the 2 precincts, a graffiti management plan, and conditions to require waste management plans that include recycling and the treatment of food waste that demonstrates the minimization of waste going to landfill.
Thank you, Councillor Messina. So that's an amendment. Now you said that you had circulated that. Have you emailed that to all councillors?
I have sent it in the chat because I don't know how to move from what we're doing now to
okay.
yes.
Councillor Messina, that's been received. So here we are, that's been put up.
Yep. That's correct.
And okay, so I'll give councillors a second to read that, and then I'll go to Councillor Newton and Councillor Amir as the mover and the seconder, and ask Councillor Newton and Councillor Amir, do you accept the amendment as proposed?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So through you, Mayor Rennie, if this is a development for people to live in rather than a public facility, so can I ask the officers if a changing places toilet would make sense when this is largely for people to live in rather than a public space?
Thank you. Mr. Rudd?
So I'm not an expert on changing places toilets, but I think the expectation is that it's some of these areas do have communal areas, and I would take that to read the intention is to provide these either in communal areas or in the larger apartments.
In the communal, yes.
Yeah. So this is something that will come out in the discussions on what should happen with the improvement plans to some of these reserves, because there are some internal to the site too. So it's conceivable this could be achieved.
Can I ask a question as well?
Sure.
I guess it's about, given that this is one stage in a series of stages, about whether this would be the right stage to be including this level of detail.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Mr. Rudd.
It is a little premature. These are typically, although it's forecasting a council expectation, I'm suggesting, but it is unusual to get to this level of detail for a development plan. But probably in terms of the graffiti management and waste management plans, but certainly if you're looking at setting an expectation for communal toilet facilities, at least in 2 locations, then it's probably reasonable to forecast that at this stage.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rudd. Is that acceptable to the mover and the seconder?
On officers' advice, I'm happy to accept.
Thank you. And the seconder, Councillor Amir?
Yes, okay.
Thank you. Councillor Messina, that amendment has been incorporated into the motion, is now part of the substantive motion that we're debating this evening. Are there any further speakers to the motion? Councillor McCarthy. Just unmute yourself, Councillor McCarthy.
Sorry, thank you, Mayor. Look, I just wanted to speak specifically both in favour of the amendments that Councillor Newton put forward earlier, which is, of course, to effectively increase the social housing component to 50% of the site, and why that is so significant. And I'm sure councillors are aware of the history of this site, being the former Huttonham estate, being the section west of St George's Road. There are many people that still live in the local area who either lived in one of the original houses along that section or live in other areas and remember it fondly as a place that in fact was the house that they were able to grow up in because it was part of a public housing provision program. Making sure that that continues to be the feature of this area is absolutely critical to the social and community diversity that we believe here in the City of Darebin is essential for our future. So I just applaud Councillor Newton on her initiative in putting forward that recommendation for us to consider. I just want to highlight as well, though, the effect of the amendments, and Mr Rudd explained in some detail. It is absolutely imperative if we are going to have literally hundreds of dwellings built in this site. And I live not far from here, so I know the area incredibly well. I travel along Oakover Road on a daily basis. It is absolutely essential that the developer is required, and it doesn't matter if it's a government or a private developer, is required to fully fund the traffic management that is required and to make this a place that is safe for people to walk and to cycle. And likewise, it should also be the developer's responsibility to fund a full upgrade of Newman Reserve. We've already seen from the report that the play space in winter will have overshadowing. So whether that needs to be relocated, the entire park needs a significant upgrade in line with our rewilding and all abilities play space strategies as well. So I'm prepared to support this because this is about achieving a set of outcomes that are in line with what this community needs, both the existing community and the new community that will join. And I think if we can say something about the people that live in this pocket, they are not opposed to increase in density as long as it is actually done in a way that is sympathetic. I'm very concerned, obviously, about the heights of some of those buildings, but I'm also aware that this is a state government project that will be pushed through whether or not we agree to it. So this is our opportunity to ensure that this community espouses the values of both this council and this community. And I really hope that the government hears clearly what our expectations are in terms of safety, in terms of traffic management now and into the future, and the community amenity that a significant upgrade to Newman Reserve and other green links in the area would deliver. So once again, very important that we make this case so that we don't end up with a box of development. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any further speakers? Councillor Greco.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, I'd like to thank the officers for assisting in preparing the motion. I'd like to thank Councillor Newton for actually putting it forward. As I said before, I couldn't put it forward because I had an amendment which then sort of played me out as a result of the rule. So I thank Councillor Newton for doing that and the officers. Look, the purpose of the motion that has been put forward was to restrict the development within the discretionary height limits that we have established as a council. And I should note that council originally proposed lower height limits to what eventually got endorsed by the minister. So what this motion does is that it keeps the development within the discretionary height limits, and it also increases the public housing component to 131 within that and also 350 private housing. Now that doesn't go way into achieving the 50% as our target, but I think that the way, with the assistance of the office, the way that the motion has been constructed, at least it leads us into that, closer to that target and to that objective. And as a result of that, the ratio between public housing or social housing and private housing is narrowed. as a result of this motion. So on the basis of that, and if this motion and if this development plan is eventually accepted, then we could say that we actually have pushed the developer and also hopefully the department and the minister to ensure that more public housing happens on site. And as we know, councillors, it's an item of topic at the moment. We need more social housing, and we need to pull every lever that we can in council through these types of resolutions in order to ensure that we achieve that outcome. Thank you.
Can't hear you. Sorry, councillors. I just said, are there any further speakers? Councillor Messina.
I just want to congratulate and say thank you to Councillor Newton, Councillor McCarthy, Councillor Greco and Councillor Amir, who've both spoken on this particular project. When you've got social housing versus private developer, and then you've got community, there's three stakeholders that have to come along the journey. And what we do as a council is ensure that all the stakeholders' visions are in place and what their directives are in place, but it's also they need to be in line and congruent with what the community, what our vision for that precinct is. And I think the amendments to the original motion will set that vision. It'll set the vision not only for this particular generation, but for the generations to follow. And I think having the extra item that I've put in place, it is to ensure that when the plans come to the planning committee, that they will consider the things that this council also identifies as being important for that particular precinct. Newman Reserve is a vital link to, and also the elevated rail to that particular precinct. So I look forward to see it evolve, and I look forward to the journey that the community come on board with us to ensure that that vision and that their vision and their safety concerns and the community concerns come into place and fruition once it's constructed. So I just want to say thank you to the other councillors that have thought, and the officers who have thought many moments and minutes to ensure that this particular precinct is the vision that the community expect.
Thank you, Councillor Messina. Are there any further speakers? Councillor Williams.
I just want to say a big thank you to the officers, because I know how many hours, but definitely how many years that this has taken to get to this stage. I also like to thank the community that have come to many sessions that the officers have organised over the years. And I'd like to ensure that when we do look at planning, especially applications, I don't think I've dealt with anything as big as this in the last 8 years I've been on council in size. It's nice to know that when we are developing something like this, that I can look back and say that I'm proud of what's been approved here, especially when you're looking at so many different styles of housing and you want to ensure that it fits in with the community that it surrounds. So other than that, I just want to say thank you to everybody and for the amendments that have been put up tonight.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Are there any further speakers? There are none. I'll therefore put that motion to the vote, and we have it on screen again. All those in favour and against? That's been voted for, and in favour were Councillors Rennie, Messina, Newton, McCarthy, Greco, Lesurf and Williams, and voting against that motion was Councillor Amir. Thank you, councillors. I will now move on to the next item on the agenda. And that is the item in relation to the planning permit for 2 to 4 Rathcown Road Reservoir. Mr. Boyle, it looks as though you're going to take us through this one.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Rennie. This site is at 2 to 4 Rathcown Road in Reservoir. It's an unusual site, this one, in the sense that 1,625 square metres in area, and it's adjacent also Bundoora Park. Now that compares with the majority of the sites along Rathcown Road and in the wider area, which are around the 700 square metre mark. So that offers up a bit of a different development proposal, as I'll describe. But in terms of the site setting, policy-wise, it's in the general residential zone, number 2. There's also an environmental significance overlay on the site as well, given it's adjacent to the park and the creek environment. As part of this process for this proposal, it was referred to the Darebin Creek Management Committee, and they've given their approval to this proposal. Council's Bushland Management Unit also were involved. Now, looking at the site, it's relatively flat. At the present time, it has a dwelling on it, and there's not a lot of landscaping. So it's quite unusual that a large site adjacent to the creek is more or less devoid of landscaping except for some trees along the rear boundary. So what the proposal seeks to do is remove the dwelling and utilise a central driveway for all but one of the dwellings. So you've got 8 dwellings in total. Dwelling number 1 is a 3-bedroom dwelling, and it has access off its own individual driveway along the west boundary. And then the remaining 7 dwellings utilise a shared driveway running through the middle of the site. So I might just share the screen, and you can see the site there at the moment without any, or with the existing dwelling on it. And then moving forward, what you see there is the layout of the proposed dwellings. So at the top left-hand corner, the dwelling unit number 1 is 3-bedroom with a double garage, and then the remaining dwellings are accessed via the rear driveway, with each having a single garage or carport. Some of the garages are a little larger, just to accommodate additional storage within the garage, and also the rear yards are much larger than what's under clause 55. The other unusual aspect is it's got a pretty low site coverage. It's only 48% versus up to 60% in the general residential zone. At the upper level, you can see they've got either 3 bedrooms for unit 1 or 2 bedrooms upstairs. What's also good about the development is it does engage with the adjacent parkland area. So going back to the ground level, you'll see the dwellings along this edge all have their rear gardens facing the park. They have access via their living room to those gardens with outlook over the parkland. Similarly, at the upper level, bedrooms, etc., face toward that parkland. So it's activating the park space. Those are east-facing dwellings, so that's an excellent outlook for those properties. In terms of the appearance, going to the elevations, the top image is of the dwellings 1 and 8 that are facing Rathcown Road. As you can see, they've got flat roofs throughout and are finished in brick, render and vertical cladding. In terms of the response to the project at a community level, there were 16 objections. Amongst the issues raised were that there were too many dwellings on the property. Neighbourhood character was raised as an issue as well. The recommendation is to approve this development. It achieves a high level of compliance with clause 55. The setbacks at the upper level will exceed or are well in excess of the requirements of clause 55. Site coverage, as I've already mentioned, there's a slight reduction in the front setback versus number 6, the adjacent property, but it's only by 200 mil, so less than a foot. So on balance, And certainly when you look at the size of the site, albeit there's 8 dwellings versus, I guess, most of the other sites in the street are either single dwellings or have 4 dwellings. It is a much larger site, and it makes use of a central driveway, which obviously, you know, is a very efficient way of dealing with the site. So on that basis, it is recommended for approval, and the conditions that form part of the recommendation deal with issues on ESD, stormwater management, tree protection, landscaping, and we seek to vary the materials palette by removing some of the render and adding some more of the cladding, which is a much more robust material. So I'll hand it back to you, Mayor Rennie, as that's the end of my presentation on this one.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. Councillors, there are no objectors nor the applicant listed to speak on this matter. So I'll ask immediately if anyone has any questions for Mr. Boyle. Councillor Greco.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. Look, my question goes to the point that was raised by Mr. Boyle in regards to neighbourhood character, and I understand that that's one of the main concerns of the objectors. Can you just expand a little bit on that, particularly the surrounding areas, whether we have this level of housing density in the neighbourhood?
Yeah, sure. Through you, Mayor Rennie. Yeah, that section of Rathcown Road comprises around 60 properties. There are more recent medium density proposals, which I just mentioned. Some have only got 2 dwellings. These are on the smaller sites. Some have up to 4. There is a site at number 51, which has 20, I counted about 20 dwellings. It's a bigger site than this one again, but I guess it's another example where if you've got one of those unusual sites in this street, and some time ago that site was redeveloped for the 20 dwellings. So there is evidence of development, more recent development, medium density type development. And then in terms of the housing forms in the street, it's quite diverse as well. I mean, there's houses with skilled-in roofs, hipped roofs, gable forms. The most adjacent dwelling at number 6 has a flat roof form. So it is a mixed character. So I feel this development does not jar or does not upset the character, given what I've described.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. Councillors, are there any further questions? Councillor Greco.
Just one further question. Can you just elaborate a little bit on the street setbacks? I understand that, that there are some issues associated with that.
Yeah, slight variation. So if we're looking again at the ground level plan, you'll see up at unit number 1, it's very hard to sort of detect it, but it's slightly forward of the adjacent dwelling at number 6. It's set back 8.2 metres, whereas number 6 is set back 8 metres. So there's a 200 mil variation in the setback being sought. But what I would say is that garage, which is your most immediate section of the building or part of the proposal to number 6, is set back further. So I feel as though there's a reasonable staggering of that front setback in relation to number 6. And certainly with a reduced setback of just 200 mil, and 8 metres is still a pretty healthy front setback. I think a variation of that minor magnitude is not going to upset the kind of the look or the feel or the rhythm of the street.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. Councillors, does anyone have a motion? Councillor O'Meara.
I'm happy to move the officer's recommendation.
Thank you. And is there a seconder? Councillors, is there a seconder for that motion? Councillor McCarthy, thank you. Councillor O'Meara.
Thanks, Mayor Rennie. it is unusual for us to see townhouses so far north in our municipality. Mostly around this area, it is single detached dwellings. And I do agree that 8 on one site is also unusual, but noting that it is a very large site, I think two blocks, and they are decent sized units, townhouses. It is good to see the 3-bedroom townhouse and also others with multiple living spaces, which is and also the low site coverage. So it is quite different from some of the other applications we see, where it really seems like the developers have worked hard to cram as much in as possible without necessarily giving consideration to how people want to live or how it will feel to live there. Also noted is the engagement with the surrounding area towards Darebin Creek. And when I first saw this plan, I can't see the clock, by the way. I don't know if there's a way to do that. Just tell me when I'm running out of time. Okay, now yeah, when I first
stop screen sharing, that would be good.
Yeah. When I first saw this, I was concerned about the impact on the creek, like one we saw a few months ago with the abuttal to Mary Creek, but this is quite a different context where it is set back, and that area of Darebin Creek, the land is flatter, so it's not it's not going to be impacting on the creek corridor itself, or on, now it's just I can't see myself, or have impacts on erosion and those sorts of things. I am empathetic towards people living in the area, in recognition that it's different and probably will be part of what we're seeing more and more, but in recognition of understanding it's a good place to live. It's quite close to La Trobe University, and they do look like quite nice townhouses. I'm happy to support this proposal.
What is obviously allowable under the Darebin planning scheme, and so on that basis I believe we're inclined to support it, and I think it's been strengthened by the conditions that have been put forward by both officers and also by DCMC.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Are there any further speakers? Councillor Greco.
I'll be speaking against this and also foreshadowing an alternative motion in regards to it that has been circulated earlier this afternoon. Look, this application is, for me, is a very line ball type application, but when I look at it from a neighbourhood character perspective, and that's the basis of which I won't be supporting it. I believe, and I think that it is too congested for the particular area that it's located in, not only in relation to the neighbouring homes in that area, but also in relation to the creek that runs on the side of the of this particular development. And as a result of that, I would have hoped to have seen on such a development, rather than having 8, which is really pushing the boundaries, that possibly 6 dwellings on this site, which would be much more spacious and would have blended in much better with not only the homes in the area, but also with the creek area in itself. So on that basis, I just find it hard to support. Again, it was a line ball decision for me, because I appreciate that the land that it's on, it's basically 2 blocks, but it's really stretching the boundaries in terms of trying to put too much into the one place, where around the this particular location there isn't that density of development that we see that has been proposed there. So on that basis, I'm not inclined to support it, and then I have a foreshadowed motion that if this motion does not get up, then I'll be putting forward the foreshadowed motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any further speakers? Councillor Amir, you have a right of reply.
Maybe I won't add anything further given the time.
Thank you. I'll now put that to the vote. All those in favour? And against? That motion is carried. We had councillors Rennie, Messina, McCarthy, Newton, Amir and Lassurf voting in favour, and councillors Greco and Williams voting against. Thank you, councillors. That's item 5.3. We'll now move to item 5.4, which relates to the development plan in Bundoora. Mr. Rudd.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. I'll just share my screen just so to quickly point out where this site is. So this application has actually, was part of an application that council refused back on the 24th of April last year. And the reason this development plan proposal comes back to council is there's a nuance in the appeal provisions because this is a development plan, and the previous proposal that council refused involved the site here, which I refer to as on the Plenty Road and the main drive corner. This is what's referred as lot S9 in the report. This one is lot S3, which this proposal specifically relates to. Previously, both proposals on the 24th of April were considered. And one of the appeal provisions that they lodged an appeal of council's decision last year, you're not able to make subsequent amendments under that provision if you lodge a review of council's decision. So that's the reason this is back here, is that council has subsequently issued an approval, which you now know is the Hilton Hotel on this corner side of Main Drive and Plenty Road. So that's gone through separately. It's still left the dispute regarding lot S3 in abeyance. So what was refused last year, and is again detailed in this report, is specific to lot S3, and it concerns a proposal to increase the height from 3 to 7 stories. Main Drive is a fairly narrow road, and what we try and avoid in an urban design sense is a building height that exceeds the width of the road. Now, 7 stories will do that. It's certainly incongruous with the character of the area. Further along Main Drive, you have 2-story forms. Across, you have 2 with dormer windows and a 3rd sort of story element. So the recommendation really is here to enable that VCAT dispute to continue on, for this site to be separated. The recommendation from last year hasn't changed in concern to this site. The height's considered too high, so the recommendation is this particular change to the development plan be refused.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. Councillors, there are no people to speak to this, so it's over to you if there are any questions. If there are no questions, I'll ask if there's a motion. Councillor Neer.
I had a question. What's the maximum allowable height at that site?
Currently, under the planning scheme, Mayor Rennie, it's 3 to 4 stories. And the proposal is to change that to 7.
Could I ask a supplementary question, which is, I guess, what's the context in which this is being proposed, given that it's such a big deviation from what we'd expect to receive? So what the proposal behind this is student accommodation, and under the current height controls in the planning scheme, they're not able to, or they say they're not able to achieve the yield required to make it viable for a student accommodation facility to work. So at 7 stories, they get their 100 beds or whatever they need to be a baseline viable student accommodation facility. And there's not the depth in the site to be able to achieve that with a 3 to 4 story height form.
Thank you. Are there any further questions, councillors? If there aren't, is there a motion? Councillor McCarthy.
Happy to move the officer's recommendation to refuse this.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Is there a seconder? Councillor Greco. Councillor McCarthy.
I don't really think there's really much to add to Mr. Rudd's explanation. It's very clear that this is a very bulky proposition, and as was just outlined in the response to Councillor Amir's question, the depth as outlined does not accommodate what's proposed. So on that basis, happy to follow officer advice as we generally do when there's a proposed refusal.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Greco.
Yeah, look, I'm happy to refuse this. The only thing that I would add is that I'm familiar with that area, and it's a very tight area as it is. And to allow it to go from the existing height limit to 7 actually will just put in tilt the whole working of that area.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Are there any further speakers? There are none, so I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. That brings us to the end of the reports under consideration for tonight. We'll now move to other business with the general planning information scheduled VCAT applications. For noting, that's moved by Councillor McCarthy and seconded by Councillor Williams. Thank you. All those in favour? That motion is carried. There are no confidential reports, so councillors, that brings us to the end of the Planning Committee meeting tonight, and to any community members who have been with us throughout this meeting, thank you. And you're always very welcome to get in touch naturally. Thank you, councillors. I'll remind you that we have a briefing immediately after this meeting, which is on another platform, so please don't go far. We will start in just 4 minutes because I know we have some external guests. So I'll see you soon, and thank you once again, and good evening to everyone.